Hi. When we began to look at the flood story a number of videos ago, I started with this list of questions and interpretive issues on the right side of the screen here that I promised, that at least I hoped that we would go through and provide some insights, if not answers to, in the various videos and details we've looked at. And hopefully, if you've watched those, you've seen that, and I just want to go over very briefly some of those here before we get into what I really want to focus on here, which is the aftermath. What was the effect of the Noah and the flood story later in anticipating other issues that came up, both in the biblical era and in ours? So we'll look at that in just a moment. So just briefly, as we've seen, there are probably two sources, the J or non-P version or the P version, but as we've seen, separating them out offers limited benefits probably. Ultimately, they're read together and they intersect very well. So we can't separate them out, but as scholars have seen, they're probably not from very different times and places as was once imagined more than a century ago, but perhaps both from the exile. So hopefully as we looked at different details, we've seen how those fit together. And the cultural context, as we've seen, is clearly with the Mesopotamian stories of the flood in the background this time of exile. And we'll look at that again in just a moment to see some of the contrasts between Genesis' story and the Mesopotamian in their theological conclusion. We looked also at the historical question, one that this is really more of an urgent for fundamentalists and others whose faith is dependent upon taking the Bible literally so that its truth is a literal, factual truth, and that's not what we're doing here. So there's certainly, as we saw, historical floods, whether in that part of the world, the Middle East, or elsewhere, but this is not a historical story. This is a mythological story in relation to the culture of the audience at the time, as we've seen. In the narrative context, we're going to look at this some more in this video of not just looking back as we did at the various causes, but what the effect of the flood story is on the rest of Genesis and really the rest of the Bible afterward. And we explored some of the translational issues as well. And that causal question number 6, we'll see in some of the later literature, they revise the question of the cause. The various options we saw at the beginning of Genesis 6 are supplemented by others fitting to later times, as we'll see in 1st Enoch and Jubilees. And the characterization of Noah and Yahweh are also continuing. As we'll see, we saw that Noah was characterized as a tzaddik, a righteous person, but we looked at some of the challenges around that, of his silence in the face of the massive destruction and his inaction when he comes out of the ark and sees the earth covered with dead, bloated bodies, and then his rebringing of death to the earth in his large-scale sacrifice, as if that's what God wanted for the return to the earth. So various questions about the characterization of Noah, as we've seen, most of those left out in later interpretations, as we'll see in a minute. And then theologically, which is the one we're going to focus on, both in its time and in our time, as we'll see. So let's switch quickly to that. Here are the 4 elements I'd like to look at today. As I was just suggesting in relation to the Mesopotamian flood stories, reading our Genesis flood story as an anti-imperial counter-narrative, whether that's to the Gilgamesh epic, Tablet 11, or the other Mesopotamian flood stories that we looked at earlier. In relation to the rest of Genesis, and this is again following the insight of Ted Hebert that I referred to earlier, that the hinge in Genesis has traditionally been understood at the end of the so-called primeval history, at the end of chapter 11, with the family stories of Abram and Sarah and their descendants across 2 generations, and then the third with Joseph's story. But Hebert suggests, and I'm following it here, that the flood story is really the turnaround, and we're going to look at that really closely to see how the flood really is the hinge upon which the rest of Genesis turns. Then we're going to look in a little detail, but not a lot, at later texts, the biblical canonical text of Isaiah, and then the intertestamental text of Jubilees, Enoch, and of course the New Testament text of the Gospels, along with a little bit from Ezekiel and a drop of Revelation and a hint at the Qumran Dead Sea Scrolls text, to see how these traditions were carried out in different contexts. Similar situations, perhaps, of anti-imperial environments, but different empires in different situations. And then finally, in relation to current events, especially as an ecological warning, and especially from indigenous cultural contexts. So let's just jump right into that. As we've been looking at with the flood and Gilgamesh, we've seen a number of aspects of, as you can see in this first section, of elements that in the Genesis story that are either taken from or identical to or very close to Gilgamesh. So we certainly know that these stories are closely related. Let me make this just a little smaller so you can, in fact, what I'll do now is make this full screen so you can see the whole thing here. We'll see these theological contrasts, and we've seen some of these, and I don't want to go over this in detail, but I want to focus on the big picture. That in Gilgamesh, and related stories, as many scholars have noted, especially recently as we've been focusing on the animal element of the covenant, as we saw in the last video. The Babylonian stories never mention animals, or only in passing, simply the raven and the dove that are sent out to see if the flood's over. But they're not concerned with the animals. They're hardly even concerned with humans, other than humans that serve the gods in the city and in the royal city Babylon, as well as the related cities of the Babylonian Empire, some of which we'll see very soon in the story of the Tower of Babel and the call of Abram in Genesis 11 and 12. So in the Gilgamesh story, as well as in Enuma Elish, which isn't the flood story, but another of the major Mesopotamian creation stories, humans are an afterthought, they're a problem, they're too noisy, they make too much of a mess, and the gods want to deal with them, but humans find their relationship with the gods. But it's clearly a hierarchical one, and the gods are not portrayed here as generous and in relationship with humans, but as above them and powerful, and yet also as cowering like dogs, as we saw, and crowding around sacrifices like flies. So even within their own cultural context, their gods are hardly prestigious, esteemed figures, but closer perhaps to what we might see in the Greco-Roman sense of gods, of Zeus and Jupiter and others, as having very strong personalities, for better or for worse, and acting apart and above from humans rather than intimate relationship with humans, as Yahweh is shown to do in Genesis and throughout the Hebrew Bible. And then finally, in Gilgamesh, the important figures are royal people, because in a social hierarchy like that, it's only the royal people whose stories really matter. But in Genesis, it's very egalitarian, as we've seen since chapter 1, when the image and likeness of God was put on all human beings. And here Noah is righteous, but he's an ordinary person. He has no particular power and no particular status. Although we'll see in the intertestamental literature, it's at least perceived slightly otherwise if it's not otherwise. So for the Genesis audience in exile, the flood story tells them something about how the world came to be and what God's concerns are, and that God's concerns are that humans not destroy the gift of the earth. Whereas in Gilgamesh, the earth is just the background for the important place where life takes place, which is in the city, in the imperial city. So that's something of the background. Let's look at it a little more closely in Genesis itself, and that's where I want to go to here. And I left my search thing up because this shows us here all the times that the flood is mentioned in Genesis. And we can see here are all the ones we've looked at, and now, as you can see on the screen, there's this mention of after the flood. And all three of these are genealogical references. I'll look at them all in order. Here at the beginning of what we know as the Table of Nations, which we'll get to in a couple of videos, these are the descendants of Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, children born to them after the flood. And then at the end of that genealogy, at the end of the Table of Nations, we see this summary at the end. These are the families of Noah's sons according to their genealogies in their nations, and from these the nations spread abroad on the earth after the flood. And then finally, after the Tower of Babel story, we hear these are the descendants of Shem. Notice just the Shem line here. When Shem was 100 years old, he became the father of Arpachshad 2 years after the flood. And this lineage here leads directly to the call of Abram and the rest of Genesis. So what we're seeing here is, this, as Hebert is noting, this clear description of before the flood and after the flood. Note that there's no parallel in Genesis of before Eden, or at least in Eden, and after Eden. Eden is never referenced again in Genesis. But the flood is here plainly as the hinge. And as is suggested just in the introductory picture I showed you, the chart I showed you, what is at issue in chapters 10 and following are two ways of life. What we see in chapters 10 and 11 is the beginning of imperial life, with Nimrod, the builder of imperial cities, and then all the people in the plain of Shinar and the city and tower of Babel. We tend to think of it as the Tower of Babel story, but they were building a city and a tower. So the construction of urban life and powerful humans and a society that is primarily oriented around cities. Whereas what we'll see in the rest of Genesis is the struggle to live differently. For Abram and Sarah and for their relatives and descendants to live outside of cities, to live independent of that, and to trust in God completely. And certainly for an exilic audience, this is saying that they are not home in Babylon, that God will call them out of Babylon. And of course we see that in other texts at the end of exile, such as 2nd Isaiah and Ezekiel and others, that are calling the people to return to Jerusalem, the ruins of Jerusalem, and rebuild it and make their home there. So placing it in a different context, which is, say, different from the context in the story of the primeval history time, and putting it into the time of the audience. And that's the tradition that we're going to see throughout these texts, whether the biblical text or the post-biblical text or text today. They're trying to take something of this story and bring it into the world of their own audience. So let's look at how that plays out in the Bible outside of Genesis. So as I noted the example from Isaiah, I won't go through all of these here for the sake of time, but I will post them on the website so you can look at them in some detail. We see primarily Isaiah and Ezekiel, and there are two modes of remembering Noah that we're going to see throughout here. One is the days of Noah, as you see in Isaiah, a days of potential judgment because of human corruption of the earth. And so here it's a promise of not to be angry, because Isaiah 54 is part of the call out of Babylon into back to Jerusalem. So it's a consoling call here, reminding the people that God promised not to have another flood. Ezekiel, writing from a very similar time period, though, offers a slightly different angle. And here he has the tradition, which we see in a number of places, as Noah of one of several righteous people, esteemed for their righteousness, here paired with Daniel and Job. And those three are paired in other places in the Bible as well. So even if these three righteous people, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were there, they would only save their own lives by their righteousness, says Lord Yahweh. And that's the beginning of a different kind of theology, that not all Israel would be saved or go down at once, but there could be a remnant, a small group of people who could be saved. And of course, that's exactly what happens in the flood story, that Noah and his family are saved and everybody else is destroyed. So that's part of the tradition here, that these people, Noah, Daniel, and Job, can live righteous lives, but they would only save themselves, moving away from the collective fate of the nations. But Ezekiel is not done with the question of judgment, because as he notes just a few verses later from the example I have there, for thus says Lord Yahweh, how much more when I send upon Jerusalem my 4 deadly acts of judgment, sword, famine, wild animals, and pestilence, to cut off humans and animals from it. So it's this tradition that, yes, there'll be no flood, but that doesn't mean that God isn't still angry at injustice and isn't concerned with the earth and will act in response. So instead, there's this quartet of judgment. And as you can see there, that exact quartet is echoed into the book of Revelation as the 4th seal there. And if you want to know more about that, you can watch my videos in the Revelation series. But that quartet there, sword, famine, and pestilence, and wild animals, is obviously signs of a culture that's falling apart internally. Rather than a flood externally coming upon it as a climate event, it's falling apart because of its own instability. And so from Ezekiel to Revelation, we see that recollection of the flood story as a question of judgment. In two texts that are in some people's Bibles and not in others, because they're in the Septuagint but not in the Hebrew Scripture, we see a similar thing in Tobit, where Noah is not associated with Daniel and Job, but associated with the descendants in Genesis, in this case Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, our fathers of old, and here about the question of being blessed in their children. So Tobit, not an apocalyptic sort of text like Ezekiel or Revelation, but one establishing family security in children and blessing. And then Sirach, similarly not an apocalyptic text, but establishing also that Noah was found, quote, perfect and righteous, as you see here as an example, and the everlasting covenant were made with him, and all flesh would not be blotted out. So Sirach, in this summary of righteous people in the Bible, bringing that forward in a relatively straightforward manner. Before I get to the New Testament text below, though, let's jump, at least chronologically, to see how that plays out in texts that maybe you're not as familiar with, but were important for the people of the time, and as evidenced by the fact that they were preserved and often translated into multiple languages. Most of the texts we're going to see here, Maccabees, Enoch, and Jubilees, come from the Hellenistic era, which is to say the 3rd or 2nd century BCE, the time of Alexander the Great, and after, when he divided his empire into different parts, and especially the southern empire headquartered in Alexandria in Egypt, known as the Ptolemaic Empire, and the northern one in Antioch or Damascus in Syria as the Seleucid Empire. And the 4 books of Maccabees focus around that time period when the Israelites in Jerusalem are beset by the cultural context of Hellenism, and they have to face the question of how much can they blend in with the neighbors around them, but especially in 1st and 2nd Maccabees in the face of Antiochus Epiphanes, their tyrannical leader, who not only wants them to merge, but wants to repress Israel's culture, including the Bible and circumcision and things like that. So in that context, Noah is brought up here, as you can see, relating it to, I'll just read the text and you can hear. Just as Noah's ark, carrying the world in the universal flood, stoutly endured the waves, so you, O guardian of the law, overwhelmed from every side by the flood of your emotions and the violent winds, the torture of your sons, endured nobly and withstood the wintry storms that assail religion. This is addressed to the mother whose 7 children were murdered by the Seleucids, and that she stayed faithful amidst the martyrdom of her children. So in this context, she's being held up as a martyr, as a not as a martyr, but as a mother of martyrs, who in the face of this terrible imperial tyranny did not give in, but witnessed her sons being destroyed for it. In Enoch, it's more complex, and I'm not going to get in all the details here. If you want to know more about First Enoch, you can do no better really than George Nicholsburg, whose translation has become standard now, and his 2-volume Hermeneia commentary has probably more than most of you would want to know about First Enoch, but certainly covers it in detail. And First Enoch is a composite of texts written over time, and I won't get in all those details, but I just want to focus on elements of it here that are relevant for our situation. The context of First Enoch is one of the ancestors of Noah, only a couple generations earlier. And in Genesis 5:24, as we saw, the text says mysteriously, not that Enoch died, but that God took him, and he was no more. And so that generated this tradition that Enoch was living in God's realm, and from there had visions of what things look like, if you will, on the other side of the veil, in the heavenly realm. And the book of Enoch collects traditions of that across a couple 100-year time period. But sometimes the Enoch traditions are intersected here with Noah traditions. And Nicholsburg's suggestion is that there was a book of Noah that was independent, perhaps even prior to Enoch, and pieces of it have been incorporated into First Enoch as we have it now. But there's no existing copy of a complete collection of First Enoch. So some of the pieces about Noah are spread out. So having said that, let's just look briefly at a couple of the elements so you don't get overwhelmed by the book of Enoch. Maybe I'll do a series on that at some point, and some of that comes out in the New Testament series as well. So we hear in chapter 10, then said the Most High, the Holy and Great One spake, and this translation is an older one because I don't have Nicholsburg online, and sent Uriel, that's one of the archangels, to the son of Lamech, and again, remember Lamech as within the lineage of Noah as well, and said to him, go to Noah and tell him in my name, hide thyself, and reveal to him the end that is approaching, that the whole earth will be destroyed and a deluge is about to come upon it. So in First Enoch, we see Noah being directed to speak to his ancestors, and also to have a heavenly vision, as we'll see, rather than the silence that we hear that God just tells him directly to build an ark and not much about it until later. So we see that continue here, and the section there in chapters 54 to 55 is simply about the waters. And then we see in chapter 60 a reference, and you see in my bracket here, Enoch or Noah, as Nicholsburg points out, some manuscripts of this have in the life of Enoch, and some have the life of Noah there. So they're interspersed. And in this section later, which I've printed the whole thing here so you can have it if you want to download it, but I'm not going to go over it here in detail. I just want to highlight a couple of points here that are underlined. So here we see, in those days Noah saw the earth that had sunk down, an image different than we see in Genesis, and cried aloud to his grandfather Enoch. So this is in the form of midrash. This is commentary that the authors are adding and filling in from the Genesis story. And I just want to highlight a couple elements here. In this underlined section, we see what they state are the reasons for the flood. And notice how this is different from what we saw in Genesis, but similar to what one would see if we were to read the Book of the Watchers, the first part of First Enoch. So let's listen to this briefly. Those who dwell on the earth, that their ruin is accomplished because they have learned all the secrets of the angels, which in the logic of First Enoch was revealed to them by those who we saw in Genesis 6:1-4, the sons of God who mated with the children of humans. And so in First Enoch, those are angels, those sons of God are angels who have rebelled against God and are teaching the children of earth secrets that don't belong to humans. And so that's what they're being condemned for. And so for that, and for all the violence of the Satans, notice plural there, and all their powers, the most secret ones, all the power of those who practice sorcery, and the power of witchcraft, and the power of those who make molten images for the whole earth, and how silver is produced from the dust of the earth, and how soft metal originates in the earth. So in other words, skills that allow people to damage the earth by mining from it and other things, along with things that make us a little uncomfortable about witchcraft, but that's the sound of First Enoch Enoch here and not the sound of Genesis, something that Genesis plainly isn't concerned with. A little later on, we see that Noah is told that the angels will make the ark, that it's not Noah's task to make it, but the angels are making a wooden building here, and when they've completed their task, I will place my hand upon it and preserve it. And so it'll just given to Noah rather than that he builds it. In the last couple of chapters of 1st Enoch, we have the final summary here, and I'm not going to look at that in detail either, because you can look at that for yourself. And then we have in the Book of Jubilees. And the Book of Jubilees may, in fact, have been written before a little of 1st Enoch, but I put it after because some of 1st Enoch is probably before Jubilees. It can be confusing. The Book of Jubilees is primarily concerned with the role of time and calendar and rituals, and who controls those, whether the people of God control them according to the Jubilee understanding of what God's intention is, or whether those are controlled by the quote-unquote the Gentiles, the nations, in this case Hellenistic empires and kingdoms in the time of the Seleucids and after. So much of Jubilees is a simple retelling of the book of Genesis, but it's midrashic in the sense it adds different pieces. So let's just look at a couple elements of that here. But Noah found grace before the eyes of the Lord, a little different language in Genesis. And against the angels whom he had sent upon the earth, he was exceedingly angry. That's God, of course, not Noah. And he gave commandment to root them out of all their dominion. And he bade us to bind them in the depths of the earth, and behold, they are bound in the midst of them and are kept separate. So that image of binding the rebellious angels is also common to Enoch, and of course that kind of image comes out into places like Revelation 20 in apocalyptic literature. So what we're seeing in texts like 1st Enoch and Jubilees is an apocalyptic merging of the ancient story of the flood with a contemporaneous warning against a final judgment that is both happening currently on the other side of the veil, current to the audience, and also will happen at some time on this side of the veil for the audience to perceive that God is concerned with ending the destruction of ending injustice on the earth and preserving the earth itself. And so we see a little further down in Jubilees that the ark went and rested on the top of Lubar, one of the mountains of Ararat, a little midrash on the question of Ararat. And that's all I'm going to focus on in Jubilee, other than it's concerned with the calendar for rituals. So we see here, after that whole explanation, for this reason it is ordained and written on the heavenly tablets that they should celebrate the Feast of Weeks, or Tabernacles, in this month once a year to renew the covenant. In other words, that the festival is written on heavenly tablets. It's not a human creation. It comes directly from God, and they should not let the Seleucids stop them from celebrating the festivals that both establish their identity as a culture, but remember God's act for them. So Jubilees and 1st Enoch are doing much of what Genesis did several hundred years later in a slightly different tone for their context. And here's another example of the heavenly tablets about the days. And then finally, I have down here, out of Jubilees, the surprising thing that it includes that Noah's sons after the flood build cities, and the others after him out of envy. At least Japheth. It doesn't say that Shem's city was built out of envy, and that's really odd, and certainly goes against the Genesis theology itself, that Cain built the city, and of course the line of Cain is destroyed altogether by the flood, and that these people built cities. Genesis is completely anti-city, as we'll see. So a little variation on it there. And then finally, the Dead Sea Scrolls Qumran document the Genesis Apocryphon, numbered in the Qumran system, as you can see there. But I didn't provide it here because the text is highly damaged, but it highlights a very similar thing, recollection of the flood judgment, anticipation of another judgment, in this case in the context of the Romans, because Qumran and the Dead Sea Scrolls community was contemporaneous, at least in the 2nd century of its existence, with Jesus and the Jesus followers. In the New Testament, we see this little saying in the Gospels, whether it's in Matthew's form here or Luke's, which is similar to the one I have printed as Matthew's, for in the days of Noah. So that's, as you can see, also echoed in 1 Peter, the sense of don't forget that God can do something at any time, and people are going about their daily life, and as it says here, eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until they knew nothing about what was coming and were completely swept away. Whereas 1 Peter shifts it to a metaphor for baptism. And that became very common, that the flood going into the waters is a metaphor for baptism. Ironically, of course, because that's exactly what doesn't happen, that the people in the ark don't go into the water. They're preserved above the water. But some sometimes when people are constructing theology, they can use metaphors loosely. So First Peter expresses that sense that later baptism into the way of Jesus was prefigured by the way of Noah. And that's part of a way of reading the New Testament, reading the Hebrew Scripture that played out in the later post-New Testament Christian era, and that's for another day as well. The other aspect that we also saw in the Hebrew Scriptures and the intertestamental literature is also carried forward in the New Testament text of Hebrews and 2 Peter of Noah as a person of faith or a person of righteousness in a world of very little righteousness. So trying to highlight that faithful individuals can be honored by God even if the culture around them is corrupt. So what about for us now? Noose, as I noted, Robert Noose in the last video noted in this article from just 2021 how recent it is that scholars are taking account of the covenant for all creation, that the anthropocentrism of biblical scholars in Western culture missed what was right in front of their face. But contemporaneously, from a very different perspective, we have the view of Wally Feiho, an indigenous Australian. And I bring up here this little summary of his life because I could not find a picture of him online. But he was an ordained minister, as you can see there, and he died in 2012. And I want to use a few of his quotes from this book, as you can see here, that we've looked at before, The Earth Story in the Bible, where he has a piece that he has these quotes from. So, he says here, the earth needs to be healed so that it can be renewed and unpolluted life can again replenish the land. The flood is the cleansing, the covering. God covers the hurt earth with water, just like we place a cut finger in our mouths to cover it with moisture from our bodies. So from an indigenous perspective, he's not seeing the destruction, he's seeing the cleansing. And then he likens it to fires in that next quote. The flood is like the fires which we indigenous Australians once used to light in order to burn off part of the land. The surface is burned and the debris is removed to stimulate new life in the land. Then he goes on with an admonition for what that means for us with this final note about Genesis 9. When the earth community and the ark touched base with the earth, everything made connection with God again. God's invitation to touch the earth and experience that interconnection is an invitation to touch God. And then finally, the covenant with all living creatures in Genesis 9 is the voice of God speaking from within the earth to earth's creatures. So for Wally Feiho and indigenous cultures, whether in Australia or elsewhere, the flood is a way to reestablish this living relationship between the living earth, the living humanity, and the living God. Not only is the earth important, it's a living thing. And as he says in his piece, alive not only with the animals, but alive with the ancestors. And that's not far from what we see in 1st Enoch and Jubilees, where Noah is talking to his ancestors who are quote-unquote dead, but still there to be talked to. Although he's not on the earth, he's in the heavenly realm. Whether it's in an apocalyptic mode or in this mode of an indigenous way, throughout time, both in the ancient world and now, we can read this story as a calling back to relationship with the earth. And I'd finally like to conclude with a couple of modern views of that from a little different perspective. Here is one from the Times of Israel, from a Jewish writer who's not a biblical scholar here, Scott Shea, who actually is the developer and CEO of an internet bank in New York City, and yet that doesn't mean he's not a person interested in the Bible or faith. And he has here, and this is from 2019, Noah warns us on climate change. And so as a faithful Jew addressing Jews in Israel, he addresses the issue of climate change, as you can see here. And I'll put the link of that on the webpage as well. And then finally, this rather sarcastic one that you can see here from Matthew Disler in 2017 in McSweeney's. And I won't read the whole thing, but I'll read a couple of lines of it so you can see the tone of what he's saying here in this piece called The Biblical Tale of Noah's Ark Revised to Account for Climate Change. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great, and the Lord said, I would like to destroy man from the face of the earth, and beast, and creeping thing, and the fowls of the air, but really, all I have to do is wait, and it'll kind of just happen by itself without my having to interfere whatsoever. So I shall do that. But Noah was righteous, and the Lord saw that Noah was righteous. And the Lord said unto Noah, I have seen that you are righteous, for thou and thy family continue to recycle even when the temperature riseth. Yea, for you even separateth paper and plastic containers, thereby facilitating the operations of municipal recycling services. So whether it's in a sarcastic mode like that, or a serious mode, as we saw from the Israeli author, or from these various texts we've seen, the flood story continues to live as a call of the Creator God and to bring humans back into intimate relations with their fellow creatures, with God and with the earth. And to this day, it's up to us whether we hear that as a good news word to live by or not. See you next time. Bye-bye.